No, it's rainy. So, like the lecture for today, and what we are going to discuss at the moment is like key performance indicators and multi-objective optimization. But before we go forward, and that we talk about key performance indicators, I would like to show you the following picture. So, basically, you have like two penguins, and one of them is saying, hey boss, here's the energy market forecast up to 2050. I finished it up last night. And the other one answers, great job, but does your model take into account the fact that we have shut down all the nuclear power plants last night? So what can we actually conclude from this picture and from that is that when you're like designing an energy system, you always make a lot of assumptions. You assume, for example, a value for your price of natural gas. You assume a value for the price of electricity. But at the end of the day, you need to account for all the possible scenarios and all the factors that can actually change from one day to another. If you take a look at this graph, you have like the time at the bottom, so from 1984 to 2040, and you have a natural gas price in dollars per cubic meter over the last years. So every curve basically corresponds to a different forecast for the natural gas price. So for example, you can see that the forecast for 85 was that it will go down until 88, and then it will go up. And every year you have like a different forecast of the natural gas price. But the truth is, as accurate and as many efforts we do in order to predict the price of natural gas, the reality is a little bit different. Like the actual natural gas price, as you can see there, is that it can go down, can go up, can go down. It has a lot of fluctuations. But basically, we cannot really say what will be the exact natural gas price in the future. It is changing a lot, it is varying a lot, and therefore, what is actually the best energy system that we can design? How do we actually design an energy system taking into account all these kind of uncertainties and all these kind of variations? So, depending on your background, maybe you will say, we should go for more conventional solutions when we are designing the heating system. Maybe we should implement a gas turbine and a cogeneration engine. It's consuming a lot of natural gas, so we are producing a lot of CO2. But at least this is a technology that we know. It has an efficiency of 35–40% electrical. But maybe you are working in the solar field and you will say, well, the key in order to ensure that our energy system is working in the future is that we should have as many renewables as possible. So maybe we should go for developing more photovoltaic panels, especially in countries like Spain, where we have like a lot of solar energy. Or maybe you just want to go for the most efficient technology. Maybe you want to implement like a fuel cell or an electrolyzer. Like the efficiencies for fuel cells at the moment is more than 60–70% for some of them. So this is by far one of the most efficient technologies that you have on the market. But at the same time that it is one of the most efficient, it is also one of the most expensive. So the thing is that we have a lot of different things to take into account. We have to take into account how much money it's going to cost us. So we need to focus on the total cost. We need to take into account how much it will cost us to actually operate the system over time. Like, if your system is using a lot of natural gas and electricity, and that your system will last for 20 years, you will have to pay electricity and natural gas for 20 years. And the price is changing a lot. So maybe today, the price of natural gas is quite low, and you're not paying that much. But maybe tomorrow, the price of electricity is going to increase again, and therefore, you will pay much more in terms of operating costs. And don't pay too much attention to the equations at the moment. We will go like further into that later. And also all these equations and all these slides are on the Moodle. So I just prefer that you focus on the concept instead. And when it comes to the investment costs, like how much does it cost to actually build our system? What is like the cost of every component? Like the taxes, depending on the system, you have to pay a tax for the CO2 emissions that you have. So, for example, I don't know exactly how it is in Switzerland, but in the Nordic countries, for example, in Norway, they are extracting a lot of oil and gas, and they decided to sustain their tax system by actually putting a tax on the amount of emissions produced by the oil and gas sector. So every time that someone is exploiting more or less like 1 kilogram of oil in the North Sea, in the Nordic Sea, the oil and gas company has to pay something like $55 per kilogram of oil extracted, which is quite a lot. Then of course you have like the emissions of CO2 that are related to the machine that you're operating. So for example, if you operate a gas turbine, you're rejecting CO2 to the atmosphere. It comes also with some environmental impact. So we often talk about the global warming potential because you are concerned about climate change. But we also have like environmental impact issues in relation to the ozone depletion potential, so the ozone layer. We also have some issues with acidification. So if we produce a lot of pollutants, and that these pollutants have a lot of nitrogen, we may pollute a lot of the water. So there are a lot of factors, economic, thermodynamic, environmental, that you should consider when you want to design a system and that you want to sell your system to someone. So this equation, the operating cost, so since you all work on project 4, you all know what is a heat pump. Anyone has an idea about the operating cost of a heat pump? Where does it come from? Yeah, exactly. So the operating costs are related to the electricity costs. Any other operating cost that comes to your mind? Maintenance. Yeah, exactly. Maintenance. Any clue about how much it is, like the maintenance cost, more or less, in percentage of the investment cost? 7%. Yeah, exactly. Usually you consider between 3 and 7% of the investments per year. Yeah, so as you can see, you have like the electricity imports and the maintenance of every unit for a heat pump. And of course, if you have a gas turbine, then you don't have like that much electricity cost, but you have like, for example, the cost of natural gas. So when it comes to the investments for a heat pump, you have an investment cost that is related to the cost of each component. So how much does it cost you for buying a heat exchanger, 2 heat exchangers, a throttling valve, a compressor? Any idea about which component has the highest investment cost per heat pump? Maybe? Huh? Yeah, exactly, the compressor. It depends a lot on the heat pump and on the material that you use, but usually the compressor is at least 60–70% of the total investment cost. But then, besides buying all the components, like the heat exchangers, the compressor, and the throttling valve, you also have all the investment related to the installation. So you're buying a piece of land, you're having like some other construction in addition to that. So the investment cost actually is something that is much bigger in terms of absolute value than just the sum of the cost of every component. And something that you haven't talked about in the operating cost, but you also have like the operating cost related to the people that you employ, obviously, so the labor work. So this amazing equation about like renewable energy is about how much renewable energy you are using like per year. Do you use any kind of renewable energy when you drive a heat pump? Or do you see any connection to renewable energy?
depends where you get your electricity from.
Yeah, exactly. If you get like electricity from a renewable source, so for example, if you get it for the windmill, let's say, or if you have like a heat pump that is driven by the solar energy, so like the solar-driven heat pump, you can consider that all the electricity that you use in your heat pump is actually green, and therefore it helps in easing the penetration of renewable energy into the market, and also in the residential sector. So that's the reason why in a lot of countries in the north of Europe, they are like trying to turn off like boilers, like gas boilers, and they try to implement a lot of heat pumps, because the electricity that the heat pumps are consuming is actually electricity from wind energy, like in Denmark, or from biomass, like in Sweden. And that's how they actually want to achieve a high penetration of renewable energy by 2020 and 2050, by developing these kind of technologies that are using green energy. Obviously, you have like, you also have like the CO2 emissions to take into account. So the amount of CO2 emissions that you have per year are related to the resources that you're like implementing. So for example, for a heat pump, if you're using your electricity not from renewable energy, but from another source, like for example, the electrical grid, and that you have a lot of gas power plants or coal power plants, your heat pump will not be so green anymore. There will be like some kind of emissions associated to the electricity that you're using. So this is like how you calculate basically the CO2 emissions related to an energy system. You can calculate basically like the amount of emissions related to the energy source of the energy that you produce. So if you have a gas turbine and that you consume natural gas, you can calculate how many CO2 emissions will be produced by your gas turbine, as long as you know how much natural gas you consume in your system. But you have like the CO2 emissions that you have during the operation. So for example, when you burn a natural gas in a gas turbine, you have some local emissions. You have like emissions that will be related to the use of your energy system. But you will also have like CO2 emissions that are related to the construction of your system, to the life cycle of your system. So your system is just not installed and it's working like that, but you had a lot of steps beforehand in order to build it and to make it work. So in France, for example, there is often this debate that nuclear energy may or may not be like a solution to actually shut down and reduce the CO2 emissions. Because if you focus only on the nuclear power plants, at the level of the nuclear power plant, you will say, well, I don't have any CO2 emissions, I have a nuclear power plant. But if you focus on the complete life of the nuclear power plant, about the operations to extract the uranium, and if you focus as well on all the operations after the operation, using the nuclear power plant, like treating the waste and taking care of it, you have some CO2 emissions that are related to all these kind of operations. So when you focus on the CO2 emissions in order to have like a better picture, you should not focus only on the emissions that you have at a local level, but at the more global one. Yes?
I read that cycle average CO2 emissions for nuclear is like 12 grams, similar to wind power, while solar is 150 at the moment.
Yes.
Because it's being built in China, so even with that, it's still really low, right?
Exactly. I mean, like usually, like nuclear is still like considered very low. But as you say, you have like 12 grams.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not zero. It's like 12. It's a number.
But it's still low.
Exactly. It's still low, but I mean, it's not zero as sometimes you actually hear it. It's not like zero carbon, completely carbon free. And also, as you mentioned, like you have like quite a lot of CO2 emissions related to the life cycle of your solar panels because they are built in China, and that you have a lot of coal-fired power plants, and you're using a lot of specific materials like rare metals, noble metals, in order to build the photovoltaic panel. And the fact to extract them actually produces quite a lot of CO2. And that's the reason why you can go as high as 150 grams, as you said. So if you want to make a comparison between like different fossil fuels, you can see that for coal, for example, most of the CO2 emissions are related to the combustion process, like up to 98%. And it's a little bit lower for diesel and natural gas. But you can see that natural gas has less CO2 emissions associated than coal. But for shale gas, it's actually quite a different picture because you have like 60% of the emissions that are related to the combustion of shale gas, but you have 39%, which is quite a high number, it's more than a third, that is related to all the other processes associated with the extraction of shale gas. So, as you know, like shale gas is like a type of gas that you don't get exactly in the same way as natural gas. You need to have some fracturation operations and so on. And this is a little bit less environmental friendly than natural gas at the moment. If you consider the complete life cycle emissions, you can see that at the end, since the chemical composition is quite similar, the absolute value of the CO2 emissions in the combustion process are quite the same. But what is actually making a big difference between natural gas and shale gas is like the other emissions that you have in the whole process. So it brings us like to the next point. So let's say that, for example, you want to minimize the cost of your system. Some other people want to minimize the CO2 emissions. So some of these objectives are actually conflicting. Maybe renewable energy, for example, they are more expensive to install at the moment, but at least you have less CO2 emissions. So somehow you have a trade-off between both. You can decide to go for more renewable energy, or you could decide to go for like something cheaper. And therefore you have to take all these factors into the balance. And that is what is called like multi-objective optimization. So when you don't want to optimize only in relation to one objective, if you don't want only to minimize the cost, but you also want to minimize the emissions at the same time, you have two different objectives, so it's a multi-objective optimization. So, let's say that one of your objectives is to reduce like the total cost, the other one is to reduce the emissions. Another possibility is that you try to minimize the investment costs. The second one might be that you want to maximize the use of renewable energy. What happens is that you have like what you call a Pareto front. And in order to explain that a little bit better, if you take the case of wind energy, for example, you may have like quite high investment costs, but you have quite low CO2 emissions. So let's say that you will be somewhere there. If you minimize the CO2 emissions, you will be somewhere there. You will have like high investment costs, but you will have no CO2 emissions. Let's say that you're aiming for the opposite. You want to have like very low investment costs, but maybe it means that you need to implement a lot of natural gas boilers. So you will have like CO2 emissions that are quite high, and you will have a low investment cost. So this solution is perfect, is optimum in relation to the investment cost, and this one is optimum in relation to your CO2 emissions. But you have a lot of solutions in the middle where you can have like a little bit more investments and a little bit less CO2 emissions. And the relation between the two, and I draw it as a curve, but it can be a line, it depends on a lot of factors. It's called like a Pareto front. So all these possibilities that you have there, they are infeasible. You cannot have at the same time, for example, low investment costs and low CO2 emissions. So this part is infeasible. And this one is feasible, but it's not optimum. If you take a point there, for example, there is something equivalent on the border, on this relation that has the same investment cost, but it has a lower CO2 emission. So this one is just feasible, but not optimal. So when in the future, hopefully, you will have to design several systems, and that you may have to work with designing new energy systems, you need to consider all these kind of trade-offs between different objectives. And this is what the Pareto front is for, actually. It's just in order to help you to make decisions and to understand which kind of compromises you need to do when you go from one solution to another. And how do you obtain this kind of figure? There are quite a lot of ways to obtain it. I mean, instead of minimizing one objective, you want to minimize the two of them. So let's say that this is your objective function. So normally you want to minimize the total cost of the CO2 emissions, but you consider in the same function like the two objectives at the same time. So you consider like the CO2 emissions and the amount of money that you are spending, and you allocate different weights to them. So the weight is actually the W that you can see there. So if you have a W that is 0.1, you can see that the factor that will be in front of objective 1 will be 0.9. So it means that you give a high priority to minimizing the investment cost, and the lower priority to minimizing the CO2 emissions. And by changing the values of these weights, by changing and saying, okay, maybe I consider that the two objectives are equally important, then you can obtain this kind of relation, which is like a Pareto front. So every point that you have there corresponds to like a different solution, and there are different ways to actually implement it. And this is quite a lot what your last project is about like designing the energy system of the EPFL campus and considering different objectives. For example, maybe you want to minimize the emissions, the operating, the investment cost, and you want to draw, these kind of relations between the different objectives. So the idea of a final project is that you come up with like 3 different solutions that you consider are interesting, like for EPFL, and you just analyze them. You say, my system, my solution here is actually quite good because I have low CO2 emissions, and it has a lot of heat pumps implemented. This one is also quite good. It doesn't have as many heat pumps, but it has a lot of solar panels, and this is the cost that it has. So, just to conclude, and to give you an introduction to the project, you had 4 projects until now, and now we are attacking the last part of the project. So, in the first part, you were analyzing the energy demands of a complete EPFL campus. So you were calculating the heating and the electricity demand per building. On the second one, you were modeling the complete EPFL utility system. So that is what you did with your MILP program. You were like modeling and trying to assess which combination of heat pumps and utilities can actually be interesting for your EPFL campus. In the third part of the project, you were analyzing different possibilities for optimizing the heat recovery on site with different combinations, and this was the NLP project. And in the last project, the one on Valley, you were simulating different energy conversion utilities, gas turbine, heat pump, and trying to see how they actually operate and interact with each other. So the last project is about suggesting 3 energy systems for EPFL and to analyze them in terms of combination of heat pumps, gas turbine, utilities, electricity that you import, electricity that you export. You may have different solutions. There is no good or bad solution. You come up with your proposal and you defend them. So you had an MILP program that you developed in the second part of the project. And you will start from that, or you can also start from the version that you have put online. I know that some of the groups, sometimes they were a little bit unconfident about the MILP model, and we give you a version that you can already use nearly completely, which is working on the Moodle. And you can use that if you are unconfident with your own model, or you can decide to merge some information. This is just there in order to give you some guidance. The second task is that you will have to optimize the energy system at EPFL considering different objectives, like minimum costs, minimum CO2 emissions. Then you can just compare them. So for example, what utilities you're using. And then you will need to analyze how sensible they are to actually variations of some parameters. So at the very beginning, we talk a bit about the changes of the price of natural gas over time. So once you have your solution, you can vary the price of natural gas in your parameters, and you can see how the total cost of the different systems that you suggested actually change with time. And you will end up at the very end with like this kind of curve, like the Pareto front, which is like the trade-off between the investments of the emissions, of the total cost of the emissions. You can decide by yourself which kind of compromise and trade-off you want to analyze by yourself. Yeah, so that was pretty much it. And remember, like the project 5 gives you like quite a lot of freedom. It gives you like the freedom to actually choose your energy system and to analyze it and to define your choices. So, is there any questions so far? Good. So now the project description is actually uploaded on the Moodle. You can use it. My colleague Shang is the one who had the responsibility and who developed the MILP model that we have put online. So you can have like a look at it. And he will also give you some explanations about how the model was built if some groups actually want to use it. But I think we can have a break. Do you want to have it now, Shang?
Maybe a break.
Okay, so you can go for a break of 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes we will just introduce the model. And we will also proceed as well with all the groups that had some issues with Valley. We are like 2-3 people who have some experience with Valley here, so we can also sit together and we can also help you with that. It's not critical that you have a perfect Valley model to go on with this part of the project. This part of the project can be done independently, most of it, without having a perfect Valley model. Thanks for your attention.